Welcome back to the deep dive. Something that we get a lot of requests for is how to handle like those everyday conversations in English, especially when it comes to like agreeing and disagreeing with people.
Right.
And so that's what we're diving into today with an episode from an English language learning podcast.
Yes.
But don't worry, we're going to go way beyond the basics here.
That's right. Because you know what I think is really interesting is how these like simple interactions can actually sometimes like reveal these subtle cultural differences or even like power dynamics.
Ooh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so in this episode that we have, like, where do they start?
Well,
it's got to be like the basic phrases, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think so too, like that sort of thing.
They do start there, like with the foundational phrases.
Okay.
But what the episode does really well is it highlights like choosing the right phrase.
Right.
So for example, simply swapping, like I think with I believe can shift the entire tone of your statement.
I see what you mean. I believe does have a little bit more weight to it.
Exactly. And that seemingly small difference can have a big impact, like when you're trying to be persuasive or navigate a sensitive conversation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like choosing the right tool for the job.
Right.
So what about like when you actually disagree with someone? Like this episode uses that cats versus dogs example.
Yes.
Which I have to admit made me chuckle a little bit.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
That example perfectly illustrates how a simple phrase like I see it differently can politely signal disagreement without like derailing the entire conversation into like a big debate.
Right, because nobody wants to be that person.
Exactly.
Who turns a casual chat into like a battle of the species.
Exactly. And what this episode really emphasizes is the importance of staying calm and respectful, even when you strongly disagree.
So it's more about understanding than just trying to win the argument.
Exactly, because even disagreements, when approached thoughtfully, can actually be really valuable opportunities to learn and grow.
I love that perspective. So it's not just about avoiding conflict.
Right.
It's about seeing disagreement as a potential pathway to deeper understanding.
Yes, and this episode gives some great tips on how to do that. It's like, for example, phrases like, I understand your point, but, or that's a good point, but, can help you acknowledge the other person's perspective while still expressing your own.
It's like you're building a bridge instead of putting up a wall.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And they also talk about the power of asking clarifying questions to like ensure that you truly understand where the other person is coming from. Sometimes simply asking a question can clear up a misunderstanding or even lead to like finding common ground.
That's so true. Sometimes we get so caught up in our own heads that we forget to really listen and make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah.
Asking questions can be such a powerful tool for like navigating those disagreements.
Absolutely. Now, while those basic phrases are a good starting point, this episode also digs into some more advanced techniques.
Okay.
Things like using I couldn't agree more or you're absolutely right to express a strong agreement. Or things like I'm not convinced, or that's one way to look at it, but for nuanced disagreement.
So we're moving beyond just the agree and disagree button, getting into the subtleties.
Right. And the episode points out that these advanced phrases can be especially helpful in like professional or academic settings where clear and respectful communication is key.
Right.
It's about choosing the right tool for the job, whether you're chatting with friends or presenting a paper at a conference.
Speaking of the right tool for the job, this episode also mentions navigating different contexts.
Yes.
It feels like that's a whole other layer of complexity.
It is, and that's what makes this particular episode so valuable. It goes beyond just listing phrases and really digs into the nuances of how language works in different situations. So for instance, you might be more informal with friends, using slang or humor, but much more careful and polite in a work meeting.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want to offend your boss or colleagues by being too casual.
Exactly. It all comes back to that awareness of context and choosing your language accordingly.
So it's not just what you say, but how you say it and where you say it.
Right.
That's a lot to keep in mind.
It is, but this episode breaks it down in a really helpful way. And one of the most interesting points I think they bring up is this concept of hedging.
Hedging? Is that like putting up a fence in a garden?
Not quite. In language, hedging is about softening your tone. Especially when discussing like sensitive or potentially controversial topics.
So instead of saying like, you're absolutely wrong, you might say something like,
right.
I see your point, but I'm not sure I entirely agree.
Exactly. You're still expressing disagreement, but in a way that's more likely to keep the conversation open and respectful.
Yeah, I can see how that would be useful, especially when you're dealing with like strong opinions or complex issues.
Right.
Do they give any specific examples of how to do this?
They do. They mention phrases like, "it seems to me," or "I tend to think," as ways to hedge your statements.
Yeah.
And kind of create that sense of openness.
Those are good ones. I definitely use "it seems to me" a lot when I'm trying to express an opinion, but I don't want to sound too forceful.
And that's exactly what makes hedging such a valuable technique. It allows you to participate in a discussion without shutting down other viewpoints.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these different pieces fit together.
Yeah.
It's not just about memorizing phrases.
Right.
It's about understanding the strategy behind them and using them effectively in different situations.
Exactly. And this episode gives us a great framework for doing just that.
Okay, so before we move on, let's just take a moment to kind of recap what we've covered so far.
Okay.
So we talked about the importance of choosing the right phrases for agreement and disagreement, staying calm and respectful, even when things get a little heated.
Right.
And using techniques like asking clarifying questions and hedging to navigate those tricky waters. So what stands out to you as like the most important takeaway so far?
I think what's most striking to me is how this episode highlights the power of these subtle linguistic choices.
Okay.
You know, we often think of language as just a way to convey information, but it's so much more than that. It's a tool for building relationships, navigating social situations, and even shaping how others perceive us.
That's such a good point, and it's something that we probably don't think about consciously very often.
Right.
But this deep dive is making me realize just how much thought and strategy goes into like those everyday conversations, especially in a language like English, where there are so many nuances and subtleties.
Absolutely. And that's why I think this episode is so valuable.
Okay.
It gives us a glimpse into like those hidden workings of language, and it really empowers us to become more effective communicators.
I completely agree. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
Let's take a quick break and then come back to explore some even more advanced techniques for mastering the art of conversation in English.
Sounds good. So, you know, building on what we were just talking about with like these subtle linguistic choices, the episode actually goes a step further.
Okay.
And it talks about how like the language of agreement and disagreement can even change, like depending on where you are in the world.
Oh, wow. You mean like how hedging might be more common in British English than American English?
Yeah, exactly. They touch on how cultural norms can influence how people express agreement and disagreement.
Okay.
So, for example, in some cultures, it might be considered rude to directly disagree with someone.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Especially someone in a position of authority.
You might need to be more indirect or use more hedging in those situations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, there are cultures where being very direct is seen as a sign of honesty and respect.
Right.
So understanding those cultural differences can be really helpful in navigating conversations effectively.
Especially in our increasingly globalized world.
Yes.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for understanding the unspoken rules of conversation across different cultures.
I like that. And the episode emphasizes that it's not just about different countries.
Okay.
Even within the same country, you might adjust your language depending on whether you're in a formal setting like a business meeting or a more casual setting like hanging out with friends.
So like you probably wouldn't use the same level of formality when you're chatting with your buddies at the pub as you would when you're giving a presentation to your CEO.
And what's fascinating is how we kind of already do this subconsciously to some extent. Like we naturally adapt our language to fit the situation. But by becoming more aware of these subtle shifts, we can become even more skilled and adaptable communicators.
It's like leveling up your conversational intelligence.
Right.
Okay, so this episode that we're deep diving into, it's really packed with insights. What else did they cover? Because I know our listeners are hungry for these tactical tips that they can use right away.
Well, they bring up something that you alluded to earlier.
Okay.
This idea of using stronger language to express either agreement or disagreement.
Right. So instead of just saying, I agree, you might say, I couldn't agree more.
Exactly.
Or instead of I disagree, you might say, I'm not convinced.
Yes. And the episode emphasizes that these stronger phrases can be really effective in certain situations.
Okay.
Like if you're trying to rally support for an idea, that stronger agreement can be very persuasive.
And on the flip side, if you need to voice like a strong objection or counter argument, using a phrase like "I'm not convinced" can really emphasize your point.
Yes. And the key is to use these stronger phrases strategically. You know, you don't want to overuse them.
Right.
Or they'll lose their impact.
It's like adding spices to a dish a little bit can enhance the flavor.
Right.
But too much can overpower it.
Exactly.
Speaking of strategy, did they talk at all about the overall approach?
Yes.
To like navigating these complex conversations? Because it's one thing to have the right phrases.
Right.
But it feels like there's a bigger picture here too.
You're absolutely right. And this episode does a great job of tying everything together by emphasizing some key principles for navigating these challenging conversations.
I think this is where it gets good.
I'm all ears.
Well, first and foremost, they stress the importance of active listening.
Right. Not just hearing the words, but really trying to understand what the other person is saying.
Exactly.
And why they're saying it.
And they even suggest techniques, like reflecting back what you've heard.
To make sure that you're on the same page.
It's like saying, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is, and then summarizing their point to make sure you've got it right.
Precisely. And that not only helps to ensure understanding, but it also shows the other person that you're truly engaged and listening to what they have to say.
It makes you a better conversational partner, not just someone waiting for their turn to speak.
Exactly. And along with active listening, they also talk about the importance of staying open-minded.
Right, because even if you disagree with someone, there's always something to be learned from hearing their perspective.
Absolutely. They even suggest approaching these conversations as opportunities for growth, rather than battles to be won.
I love that it takes the pressure off of having to be right all the time.
Yes, and it allows you to be more receptive to new ideas and perspective, even if they challenge your own beliefs.
Which can be really uncomfortable sometimes, but also incredibly rewarding.
It is. And finally, the episode emphasizes the importance of taking your time. Don't feel pressured to respond immediately, especially in those complex or emotionally charged conversations.
That's something I definitely need to work on. I tend to jump in with a response.
Well, it's something we all struggle with to some extent. But this episode reminds us that it's okay to pause, take a breath, and really think through our response before we speak.
That's such good advice, not just for conversations in English, but for any conversation where you want to be thoughtful and intentional with your words.
Absolutely. And sometimes that extra moment of reflection can make all the difference in crafting a response. That's both clear and impactful.
Okay, so to recap, we've got active listening, staying open-minded, and taking our time. Those are like the 3 pillars of navigating complex conversations, no matter what language you're speaking.
Exactly. And those principles, combined with all of those tactical phrases that we discussed earlier, really give you a comprehensive toolkit for communicating effectively in English.
So it's not just about memorizing a bunch of phrases. It's about understanding like the deeper principles behind them and applying them in a way that feels natural and authentic to you.
Precisely. And that's what I think makes this episode so valuable. It gives us a framework for not just speaking English, but truly mastering it.
I love that, mastering the art of conversation in English. It sounds almost like a superpower.
In a way, it is.
As much as I'd love to keep geeking out on this topic all day, I know our listeners are eager to hear how this all comes together. So let's move on to the final part of our deep dive. Where we'll explore like those key takeaways and how you can put all of this knowledge into practice in your own conversations.
Sounds good.
Okay, we've covered like a ton of ground here, from those like essential phrases to those big picture strategies for handling like even those really tricky conversations. I feel like I've leveled up my English skills just listening to you. But you know what really stuck with me was that idea that even disagreements can be valuable if we approach them with the right mindset.
It's so true. And this episode that we've been discussing really drives that point home. It encourages us to see those differences of opinion not as roadblocks, but as opportunities for growth and understanding.
I love that building bridges, not walls. It's like a mantra for better communication, no matter what language you're speaking. So before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to you, the listener. This whole deep dive has been about giving you the tools to confidently navigate conversations in English. So think back to a recent conversation where maybe you struggled to express yourself or where things got a little heated.
Right.
How would you approach that situation differently now?
That's a great question to reflect on.
Yeah.
Think about those specific phrases that we discussed, those subtle shifts in language and those core principles of active listening, open-mindedness, and taking your time.
Right.
How could you use those tools to navigate that conversation more effectively?
And remember, there's no one right answer.
Yeah.
It's all about finding what works best for you.
Right.
For your personality and for that specific situation. It's about taking all of this knowledge and making it your own.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment.
Right.
The more you practice, the more natural and confident you'll become.
Yeah.
You might even find yourself enjoying those challenging conversations once you have the tools to handle them with grace and skill.
So to sum up this deep dive, you've now got like a whole toolkit of phrases and strategies to confidently express yourself in English.
Right.
Whether you're agreeing, disagreeing, or just navigating those really complex conversations that make up our daily lives.
And remember, language is constantly evolving, so keep learning.
Right.
Keep practicing and keep exploring those subtle ways that you can use language to connect with others.
Yeah.
Share your ideas and make your voice heard.
Beautifully said. That's it for our deep dive into the art of conversation in English. We hope you found it helpful and insightful. Keep those conversations flowing, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.
For another deep dive into a topic you care about.